so happy to be here with Adam Berinsky. Adam is a longtime scholar of public opinion who has done more to advance the study of misinformation than almost anybody, in part because he got to it early. He was studying it before Donald Trump was elected, before anyone had ever heard of COVID, Brexit, et cetera. Adam, can you just sort of tell us what drew you to the topic initially?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for having me, Ethan. It's something that was really interesting to me. So I've studied American politics, since I was in grad school in the mid-1990s. I'd seen a lot of crazy stuff out there in terms of what people believed and stories. But it was the summer of 2009 that, even in this case, seeing a lot of crazy stuff. This was really crazy stuff.
Right.
So stuff about death panels, that the Affordable Care Act contained provisions that would make it easier to kill grandma, right. To save money. Stuff about Obama's birth certificate, so that there was the story going around that he was born in Kenya or Indonesia or somewhere else. And, just sort of like, even as someone who had studied really weird stuff in American politics, I thought, this is especially weird. Like we're entering this time. And so, I'd just gotten tenure, so I could do whatever I wanted. And I thought this would be kind of interesting for a few years to see what's going on here. Why are people believing these things, and what can we do to change their minds?
Right. So can you tell us a little bit about what's changed since then? Obviously Barack Obama is no longer president. No death panels have come into existence so far as I know. Mm-hmm. The world has changed profoundly, and so has our understanding of misinfo. Can you talk about not only how misinformation has changed, but also how our understanding of it has evolved since then?
Yeah, I think that back in 2009, I was very naive in sort of thinking that this is a problem, that the solution to false information is true information, right? And just sort of thinking about the thing that we need to do is figure out how can we correct this misinformation and move on to the next thing. Right. And so, I think that was naive in a number of regards, especially because thinking that we could kind of fix the information environment. I think one big thing that has changed, and I think it's more in the attitude of people who are trying to fight misinformation than sort of the information itself, is thinking, back then we're thinking, if we need to bring in credible sources to correct, we bring in people who are impartial, like fact checkers. So, I think there was a lot of hope back then, things like Snopes.com, factcheck.org, that we could bring in these independent trained journalists who could come in and say, you might have heard this thing that Obama was not born in the U.S., but that's not true, and here's the evidence why. And, I think there's been a lot of screaming into the void of that, where, if I'm someone who believes a piece of misinformation, you're a fact checker and you say, well, that's not true, you can change what you think about the information, or I can change what I think about you, right? And so I think what's happened is a lot of these sources that we thought would have credibility don't have credibility. And so that makes it a much harder problem to think, how can we bring in, who is the sort of the voice of truth, right? The authority that we can bring in to say, you might have heard this thing, but it's not true, and here's credibility. Here's a credible way to debunk that particular piece of misinformation.
So, as you, I think, just did, a lot of people who study misinformation, who are invested in stopping the spread of misinformation, talk about the need for solutions. We need to solve this problem. I'm wondering if you could explain what precisely you think the problem is that needs to be solved. And if you could explain why we need to solve whatever that problem is.
Yeah. I think at a kind of sort of taking a step back, a fundamental level, I think that democracy and sort of communication between political elites, so I don't mean fancy people, but, politicians and ordinary citizens, requires communication on a common ground, right? And so I think one of the most important things, it's the old Daniel Moynihan quote, right? You're entitled to your own arguments, but you're not entitled to your own facts. I think that's really important, is that if we want to have communication in a democratic society, we really need to have everyone on the same page and sort of thinking, I can oppose the Affordable Care Act because I don't think that we should have government-run healthcare, but I shouldn't oppose the Affordable Care Act because I think that there's going to be death panels.
Right.
I might not respect Obama. I might not want to vote for him, but if I think that he is some foreign agent who's here to undermine American government, then it's very difficult to have a conversation there about kind of what should we do as a country. So I think at a fundamental level, it's about sort of having everyone on the same page in terms of facts, right? And sort of having disagreements arise, not because I have a sense of reality that is different than your sense of reality. So I think that's sort of like a basic principle. I think at another level too, we need to think about kind of what is the nature of political competition in a sense. It's like, are we fighting over facts or are we fighting over policies? And I think that if we're approaching the same problem with different realities, then it becomes very difficult to have any sort of compromise of that. I think that that's what you've seen over the last, it's going on 2 decades now of American politics.
Right. What is your sense based on the literature, what the harms of misinformation have been? Right? We identify it, we know it exists, we know it's prevalent, but what specific harms do you think we can credibly attribute to misinformation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. But I would say, sort of off the bat, the set is less than less than most people might think, right? And so, thinking about misinformation, people often ask, is misinformation a cause of political divide or is it a symptom of a political divide? And I think the answer is a little of both there. But I think that when it comes to sort of actual policy implementation, I can think about examples of real harms that came. So thinking during the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of unsupported. So I don't want to sort of, I'm using the terms true and false here interchangeably with supported and unsupported claims. Right. But things like, that there's certain folk remedies that are going to cure you, right? And so people who are sick, who are undertaking these, then maybe that's not the best thing. And it's not just about COVID. It's thinking, I've been doing a lot of work on health misinformation. So things like cancer treatments. There's a lot of kind of holistic medicine that is, sort of that's saying like, don't listen to your doctor. It's more important to, treat the underlying cause with, this natural supplement that I just happen to be selling for a lot of money, right? Same thing with vaccines. So I think that there are real tangible harms. And, I've talked to a bunch of doctors who are, sort of on the ground and tell me about things, people who come to them having gone under these alternative treatments that made their underlying conditions a lot worse. And in fact, so bad that they can't actually, be supported by medical technology. So, I'm a political scientist, so I study politics, but I'm going to medicine because that this is something that there are real tangible harms that we can say. So with that in mind, we can think about other sorts of political controversies. So, like the thing that spills into from medicine to politics is vaccine policy, right? And that this is, as someone who is a parent, I remember, sort of going through this, sort of finding the information about vaccines and being, careful and cautious, but realizing, sort of as a public health matter, this is really important.
Yeah.
So, we've seen, sort of critical cases of measles outbreaks, smallpox, that these are real public health problems, but they have political causes. They're rooted in political causes. So I think, that's important. But I think directly thinking about one political example is thinking about misinformation or, sort of unsupported claims about voter fraud, right? They're kind of thinking about what's happened in this country over the last, it was really after the 2020 election, but even before that, that there were claims about voter fraud, that, Trump in the run up to the 2016 election was, saying that, they're going to try to steal this election from me. Here's what's going to happen. Setting himself up for a discussion of what happened if he lost. He won. But we saw those arguments played out in 2020. And the cost there is the trust in government, the trust in not just the particular outcome of an election, but of the electoral system and, by, sort of by reasoning, the government more generally.
Do you think, so my conjecture, having also studied this now for about 10 years, is that to the extent misinformation is a problem, it's a problem pronounced among a subset of people. So oftentimes when we think about misinformation, we assume that, lots of other people believe and act upon misinformation, but in reality, it's a smaller set of particularly passionate people.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm curious to know your take on the prevalence of people who aren't just exposed to misinformation, because it's one thing to be exposed, it's another to, believe it and act upon it and change your views or behaviors in some way. So I'd love your take on how many people you think actually not just see it, but believe it and do something because of it.
Well, I guess I would take a slightly different spin on your question. I think that that's an important distinction to make. The people who are actively believing this versus everyone else. So, I talk a lot about this in my book, Political Rumors, where kind of the first part of the book is trying to understand who believes misinformation and why. And there I'm looking at the believers, right? These are kind of the tinfoil hat kind of core folks. I always say that, think about that relative that you're always trying to avoid at family events who's got some crazy story. So you have those folks, and then you have the people who reject that information outright. But there's a third group, the people in the middle, right, who are saying like, well, I don't necessarily believe this, but I don't necessarily not believe it either. And so I think that's a really important thing to think about, especially when it comes to politics. Sort of one of the old saws wherever I talk about the ordinary people in politics, I say, most of the people most of the time don't pay attention to politics, right? Any audience I talk to, I always say, it's like, you're weird, right? Sort of like, you're weird because you're here listening to me talk about politics. And most people wouldn't do that. So I think what's important is, sort of people listening to this are probably politically engaged. So don't think like yourself, right? Think like the average person. And so the worry is, especially when it gets at this notion of larger questions of trust, of faith in government, is not that I believe that, say, there's going to be death panels, but, I hear these stories, maybe I get a little suspicious. So it's these people kind of the don't knows or the not sures. Right. And so I think that when we think about the danger of misinformation, it's not just for the true believers, but it's for these people who have been exposed to misinformation. So I call them the incidentally exposed. As you said, right, they're just exposed to it. But, in a situation, in a context in which people aren't paying close attention to politics, which again is almost all the citizens in the U.S., that just exposure to this could have negative consequences there.
There's a debate in the literature about whether or not misinformation is a supply problem or a demand problem, whether or not really what we're looking at is what we call the misinformation problem is actually just people's unquenchable thirst for partisan content, regardless of its truth valence. Alternatively, we're looking at a situation where part of the information environment is being deluged with false content, right? I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this debate. Do you think misinfo is a demand problem, that people love it and they want more of it, or it's a supply problem? There's too much of it and we haven't done enough to just prevent the supply.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, at the risk of, sort of being, the stereotypic social scientist, right? It's both, right? And so, but I do think, I think that it's important looking on both sides of that. So, when I talk about my own research, I often say is like, I study the demand side because I was trained like a social psychologist. When I want to learn about things, I run surveys to see what do people believe. I run experiments to see, can I change their mind? That's very focused on the individual level.
Sure.
And my work is all focused on that. But I think it's really important to recognize that that's only one half of the equation there. So when I'm focusing on solutions, things we should do, I do focus on the demand side. But when I think about the current information environment, I think the biggest problem is on the supply side, right? Sort of when people ask me, what can we do to fix this problem? I say, well, it would be great to have politicians who behave better, right? And didn't spread
Right.
misinformation. Or again, sort of whatever you want to call it, misinformation has become a loaded term. So unsupported claims. So, I think like if we really want to get tracked, sort of really get traction on this problem, I think that we do need to look at the supply side, right? But I'm very much, sort of alluded to this, very much a top-down kind of view of the world where, I guess what someone once said, it's kind of ironic given that I spent my whole career studying ordinary people in politics, but I strongly believe that ordinary people don't pay a lot of attention.
Sure.
And the action is in this elite messaging. So what I would say is that there are definitely some demand side points there. There are people who voraciously consume this kind of partisan misinformation. But, if we had a better information environment, if politicians didn't try to spread, unsupported claims, then I think that we would be better off than we are today.
You've recently written a number of papers about AI
Mm-hmm.
that offer, I think, a fair bit of hope. I'm wondering if you could describe those papers in brief to the audience, because I think they'll surprise a lot of people.
So this is the stuff with Rand and Pennycook and Tom Costello. So I should say that this is David Rand, Gordon Pennycook, and Tom Costello. Been working with them, but this is really, this came out of work that they did, and I kind of hopped on, which is very exciting to me, but I do want to give them proper intellectual credit. But here the idea is, so the kinds of stuff that I had been doing were what I call bespoke interventions, where, sort of on the death panel rumor corrections, which is something I published on, over 10 years ago, but looking at how we could correct death panel misinformation. And what I said is we need to have unlikely sources who have credibility because they are unlikely sources of corrective information come in. So in this case, having Republican politicians saying like, okay, right, that these death panels, you might have heard of them, they don't exist. But in that case, I need to find the right message. I need to find the right messenger. That's really difficult to scale up across different issue areas. So what we're looking for are ways that we can scale up interventions that can be effective. And so here's where AI comes in, is what Tom, Gordon, and Dave found was that you can debunk conspiracy theories by having a bot, the debunk bot, that will have a multi-phase interaction with the user, where the user first says, I believe this, this particular conspiracy theory, and here's why. And then you have a conversation where the bot tries to argue against that. And what I found is that it can be very effective, huge effects there. Now we've extended this. There's a co-authored paper I'm on that was published looking at political persuasion. We've also extended this to anti-Semitic stereotypes. We're working on trust in government now. So we're finding, in general, this can work really well, like has a big effect, and it also is durable over time. But there's some caveats there. So that's the good news, right?
What's the bad news?
So the bad news is that, anything that can be used for good can be used for bad as well, right? And so, it's not that. So AI, it's what I would say is like maybe where people would be surprised is that to the extent that you've heard about AI and false information, unsupported claims, it's mainly been like AI is going to create this flood of bad information that's going to basically overwhelm the system. And so we said, well, okay, that might be true, but AI can also be employed to counter misinformation in a way that we can do at scale.
Right.
Now, but what AI can, what we found is AI can persuade you to not believe particular beliefs. But then the flip of that is if it can do that, it can probably persuade you to believe particular things there. And so, it's really, it's a tool, and it's an effective tool, but it's also a tool that could be used for nefarious purposes.
Sometimes I get really optimistic because of AI for the following reason. We see that in surveys, people report one of the most common uses of AI is basically fact checking the news. Large language models are structured to be accurate, right? The companies have enormous financial incentives for them to provide accurate responses. Contrast that with social media companies where the incentive is for engagement, regardless of accuracy.
Yeah.
So part of me, so if you had to project the next 5 years, I think a fair bit of our internet lives and our everyday lives are going to just sort of move toward interactions with LLMs. Am I right to be optimistic?
I'm not generally an optimistic guy, right? So this is, sort of to say that I think that you are not wrong to be optimistic about that. But here's, let me kind of
Be the
throw a
pessimist.
couple of
Sure.
couple of flies in the ointment. Is, so these experiments that we've done show a lot of effectiveness, but these are people who are willing to engage with these conversations online. So, what we're thinking about and what I'm especially interested in, I think, as a political scientist, I think, well, okay, at a system-wide level, what can we do?
Yeah.
Is thinking about, okay, we can show that people who are willing to have this conversation can be persuaded. How many people are willing to have that conversation, right? That presumably people who are dug in won't want to have that conversation. Okay, but granted, that's a small portion of the population. But going back to what we talked about earlier, these people who are not so sure about this, these are the people who are disengaged with politics.
Right.
So if I say like, hey, you can talk to DebunkBot for 45 minutes about politics and learn something, be like, thanks, but no thanks there. So it's not that I'm pessimistic. Like, I think the solution could work. And as you said, right, the incentives are such that we can
I'm more optimistic about the incidentally exposed, right, in your language.
But then the question is that how can we get these incidentally exposed to our technology?
Sure.
And that really
But they could just go on ChatGPT and ask, did Donald Trump get arrested in New York City? And ChatGPT will say no, whereas you can imagine Facebook giving them a fake image of Donald Trump being arrested.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I think that's right. Saying aside, like, right, there could be hijacking the
sure, of course,
there. But I guess it kind of like, who's the kind of person who's going to go on, I guess, is the person who's going to go out actively seeking that information is small.
A curious person.
Right.
Yes.
And so what I'm really interested in, like I said, I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic about this. I think this is a problem that we need to solve, is thinking about how can we scale up these interventions in a way that ensures that it reaches folks. Okay, so let me kind of here. So I was talking recently to a friend of mine from college who works on political campaigns, and he said, I've read this stuff on political persuasion with AI chatbots. I saw your name was on here, this political persuasion paper.
Yeah.
He said, like, I just want to sort of talk, like, do you think that this is scalable? And I said, like, well, to be honest, thinking about doing this at scale, like, the biggest problem is how are you going to find people in the wild? So let's say your campaign trying to persuade people. How are you going to be able to capture these people to engage with the conversation? And they said essentially that was exactly his worry. He's like, it's not that it doesn't work. It's that I can't find these people who are going to do this. So, but there are other solutions, right? Finding ways to get captive audiences.
Yeah.
So like if you want to use, it could be like if you want to use social media, then you need to have some sort of engagement there.
Right.
So there are ways that we could incentivize that. So that's a hard problem. It's not a solved problem. And given what we know about general appetite for political news, I'm thinking that's going to be a really, really hard problem to solve.
So let's say the social media companies adopted the Berinsky point of view, and they're going to have a perfectly optimized Swiss cheese model of interventions. We still know that all the interventions effects are small, right? I mean, they're modest effects. we wouldn't really be solving the problem. We would be
Right.
mitigating or limiting the problem. Is that fair?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's absolutely right. And that's the right way to think about this. So, I think that a lot of what I've been trying to do when I talk to apply community, so talking to doctors, talking about folks who are doing this is getting them to reset their expectations.
Right.
So, that for a long time, people are looking for the magic bullet, right? I wave my magic wand and the problem goes away. And, so whenever I talk to groups, I always say, look, I know you brought me here because you want me to say, here's the 3 easy things to do to fix your misinformation problem. And I always say, I'm not going to do that because it doesn't exist. And anyone who tells you it does is a snake oil salesman. And so, part of this is resetting expectations. I guess the good news is that things have been bad for so long that, people are like, okay, yeah, we're not going to solve it. And so, my hope is to get people in a different mindset where thinking about, we're in the world that we're in where things are bad. If we had these different interventions, things could be a little better. We could reduce the sharing of misinformation by a couple percentage points.
Sure.
I believe it's like, wouldn't you rather be in that world than the world we're in now? Like, I know I would be, right? So I think it's, getting people to out of this, sort of solving the problem to mitigating the problem.
Gotcha.
Right. And so I think that's sort of reframing it that way. I found it's very effective, so going back to the doctors, back in 2018, I gave a talk to a group. The American Board of Internal Medicine has a policy foundation. And the head at the time asked me to come in and give a talk about political misinformation to say essentially to the doctors, like, you're next. And I gave that talk and this is very interesting. And I didn't go to their conference for a few years. But then in 2022, I was invited back and I want to talk to them. And they're like, oh my God, you were right. What can we do? And I said, well, there's these little things we can do at the margin. I watch their faces fall.
Right.
And so my mission is to get people, excited about small effects.
Okay.
And I do think that we are moving that way, so the longer we go and it's very clear, like there's nothing that's going to come in and clean up the information ecosystem.
Right.
People are like, oh, okay, yeah, I would rather be in a world in which things are a little better.
Sure, of course. So last question. So we should buy your book first, Political Rumors. Other than that, if someone wants to help mitigate misinformation, not solve, what are 3 things that a sort of everyday person could do?
Yeah. Well, I'd say that one thing is to recognize that experts aren't sort of necessarily the best people to deliver the source of misinformation, to debunk misinformation. Right. So like one example I give is, thinking about, when I was at MIT, I talked to a prominent climate scientist. And he said, I fight against misinformation. I go to these climate denier conferences and I say, I am a professor, a scientist at MIT. Here's the right information. I was like, that would be great. Like, that's the world should be, is like, yes, you're an expert. I'm going to listen to you. But in a lot of these communities, being an MIT scientist gives you less credibility.
Right.
So, figure out like who's the best person to deliver that message. It's not a climate scientist. So, in the world of medicine, thinking about vaccine hesitancy, who's the best person? Is it a group of doctors? Maybe, right? It should be, right? They have the knowledge. Right. But then people might say, oh, you're just in the pocket of big pharma. Right. So, thinking about if you have groups that are concerned about the link between vaccines and autism because they've heard this bad information, maybe having the parents of autistic children saying like, hey, maybe you heard this, it's just not true there. So I think separating the expertise from the delivery and the correction, I think, is a really important way. So, like if you're at a family gathering and you have a very conservative, relative, you say like, hey, I'm a liberal. I'm a liberal because we've been talking about this for 15 years. Like, you're probably not the best person to correct that. So I think finding that. So that's one thing. A second thing to think about is like, it's just really important, to focus not just on the people who are these hardcore believers, as we talked about, because I found it's really, really hard to move them. And I don't want to say that we should give up on them, but by focusing on those people, we're missing these uncertain middle, right, that we talked about before. So I think focusing on that as well. Okay, so that's 2. And then number 3 is just, trying a lot of different things. So there's a lot of different academics who are, trying to sell their own solution, right? And I think in part, that's right. That's what academics try to do. I try to publish papers. I try to say I'm the expert. That to recognize that no one has the solution.
Right.
So kind of keeping an open mind and thinking about different ways that we might be able to combine solutions. So rather than looking for the single fix, and not just focusing on like, hey, I've got this thing that can move belief by 1 or 2%, thinking how might we be able to combine some of these different techniques there, and really being creative about thinking about the problem and thinking about, how different strategies could be combined in a way that the whole is more than the sum of its parts.
Right. That would seem to be a great outcome, and I want us to end on that note of optimism. So thank you, Adam.
Great. Well, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Great.
Okay, I don't know.